Imagine, if you will, just a physical city.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right, but not just any city. Picture like a sprawling, sun-baked urban center. The air is thick with dust. The streets are this tangled maze of industrial blocks and residential alleyways, and just every corner feels fraught with tension.
Sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, and now imagine this city gets bombed into absolute oblivion, like the architecture is completely shattered.
Oh, wow.
And then a few generations later, those ruins are completely frozen over in this sudden, catastrophic, like futuristic ice age.
Wait, an ice age? That is quite the pivot.
Right. And then you fast forward again, the ice melts. The city's demolished, paved over, and replaced with a glossy, high-budget, beautifully rendered replica that just kind of feels wrong.
Like it lost its soul or something.
Exactly. It looks spectacular, but the soul is entirely gone. And then 20 years after the city was first built, a single, incredibly stubborn architect decides to painstakingly rebuild the original city brick by digital brick entirely by themselves.
Just fighting against the very tools they're using to build it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it sounds like the plot of a sweeping dystopian novel. Or perhaps a deeply bizarre multi-generational architectural experiment.
I know, it really does. But we aren't talking about physical bricks and mortar today. For this deep dive, we are examining a stack of incredibly unique sources.
Yeah, we've got a lot to get through.
We really do. We've pulled from exhaustive community wikis, massive Reddit threads that span like over a decade of arguments, dense tactical strategy guides, and what I think is the absolute crown jewel of our research today.
The Discord logs.
Yes, a raw, real-time Discord chat log from April 2026.
It's just a fascinating collection of digital archaeology. We are essentially sifting through the remnants of a community's 2-decade-long obsession.
Obsession is literally the perfect word for it, because our mission today is to explore the legendary digital city known to you and millions of others as Strike At Karkand.
A classic.
Truly, we are going to uncover its accidental genius when it first debuted in the game Battlefield 2. We're going to examine its absolutely wild, futuristic Ice Age evolution in Battlefield 2142.
Which is such a weird era to look back on.
Oh, we're going to spend a lot of time on that one.
Right.
And then we'll look at its rather flawed, big-budget remake in Battlefield 3.
Right, the one where they kind of missed the mark.
Exactly. But the real destination of our journey today, the culmination of all this history, is a dedicated player who goes by the name EIGuimaraes.
Yeah, this is the part I'm most excited about.
Same. We're going to unpack exactly why this individual just spent countless agonizing hours recreating Strike At Karkand from scratch inside the modern engine of Battlefield 6.
And why, if you have any love for multiplayer gaming, you need to go experience it right now.
Yes. And to give this some much-needed broader context for you listening, it's crucial to understand that this isn't just a nostalgic retrospective about a video game map.
No, not at all. What we're really exploring here is the underlying theory of level design. We are looking at the psychology of digital combat.
Like how digital spaces actually dictate human behavior lately.
Exactly. We're examining how the specific, almost accidental limitations of older technology created a tactical depth that modern hyper-advanced games often just completely miss.
Yeah, they just gloss right over it.
And perhaps most importantly, it's a rigorous study in how community, passion-like, raw, unfiltered player dedication can actually outlive and in many cases out-innovate official corporate support.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because before we can truly appreciate why someone in April 2026 would go through the technical headache of rebuilding Karkand from the ground up, we have to understand what made it the absolute pinnacle back in 2005.
We have to look at the origins.
Right. I keep seeing it referred to in these wikis as the Dust 2 of the Battlefield franchise.
Yeah, that comparison to Dust 2, which is, the most famous map from Counter-Strike, it speaks to its ubiquity. It was everywhere.
Everyone played it.
Everyone. And to understand its brilliance, we have to look at its architecture within the original Battlefield 2 iteration, which was built on the Refractor 2 engine. Analysts constantly point to what they call the 7 lanes framework.
Okay, wait. 7 lanes. Because I play a fair amount of modern shooters, and maps today usually have, like 3 main paths?
Yeah, typically a left or right and a center.
Right, you have a left flank, a right flank, and a center brawl area. 7 just seems incredibly chaotic.
Yeah.
How does a developer even structure that without players just wandering around lost?
Well, they do it by weaving those lanes into a believable urban fabric. Modern game design often funnels players into highly predictable linear paths.
Yeah, they feel like arenas instead of actual places.
Exactly, they feel artificial. But original Karkand felt like a lived-in, dense city. Let's break those lanes down real quick.
Let's do it.
You had the main thoroughfares, the wide paved streets where the heavy armor like tanks and APCs would push.
Okay, that makes sense for the big vehicles.
Right, but intersecting and running parallel to those, you had the waterways and canals for stealth flanking, you had dense residential alleyways, specifically scaled for close quarters infantry combat.
So nowhere for a tank to fit.
Precisely. And then you had accessible rooftops for overwatch and sniping. You had the industrial perimeter for broad sweeping vehicle maneuvering.
That's 5.
Yep. And you had subterranean low ground areas for cover. And finally, the marketplace intersections that acted as chaotic central hubs connecting it all.
Wow, okay. It sounds incredibly dynamic on paper. But as I was reading through these strategy guides from 2005, there's this massive recurring complaint, or maybe it's like a badge of honor, about the meat grinder.
Ah, yes, the infamous meat grinder.
Specifically at these 2 capture points called the square and the hotel. If this map had 7 distinct lanes of attack, why was it famous for these brutal gridlocked stalemates where nobody could move an inch?
Well, you're touching on the core paradox of Karkand. The 7 lanes existed, and they offered incredible tactical freedom, but they required intense team coordination to utilize effectively.
And we know how rare coordination is with random players online.
Exactly. If an attacking team, in this case the U.S. Marine Corps, lacked that coordination and simply followed the path of least resistance, they inevitably funneled their entire 32-player team into only 3 or 4 of those central lanes.
Just a massive traffic jam.
Yeah, and when that happened, the Middle Eastern Coalition defenders could effectively lock down those specific choke points, completely halting the advance.
I'm really trying to visualize the frustration of that. Like, think about the last time you were at a massive stadium or a concert, and everyone tries to leave through the same 2 exit doors at once.
Even though there are 5 other empty doors down the hall.
Right, people get crushed, tempers flare. Why would players voluntarily subject themselves to a map that actively punished them with these frustrating bottlenecks?
The answer lies in a deeply psychological game mechanic. The mode wasn't a standard symmetrical battle. It was called Conquest Assault.
Okay, stop there. What exactly does Conquest Assault mean in this context? I mean, I understand standard capture the flag, but these guides make it sound like a completely different beast.
It really is. In a standard symmetrical game mode, both teams start at opposite ends of the map with equal resources, an equal number of flags, and a secure base.
Pretty standard stuff.
Right, but Conquest Assault is fundamentally asymmetrical. The U.S. attackers started outside the city limits with an uncapturable main base and a 30-ticket advantage.
And just for clarity, think of tickets as your team's collective pool of lives.
Yes, exactly. However, the attackers suffered from a constant, unrelenting ticket bleed.
So they're losing points just by existing.
Precisely. Imagine a ticking clock where every few seconds a life is subtracted from your team's total, regardless of whether anyone gets shot.
Oh, wow.
The only way to stop this bleed is to push forward and capture territory from the defenders.
So the attackers absolutely had to push. They couldn't just sit back on a hill played defensively and wait for the enemy to make a mistake.
No, the game is actively penalizing them for standing still.
It is wild.
It created immense, desperate psychological pressure. You had no choice but to throw bodies at that hotel choke point. You had to break through.
Just massive casualties.
Yeah, and because the infantry combat was so tightly packed into these narrow streets and intersections, Karkand became the ultimate point farming map.
Point farming, like getting a high score.
Yeah, because in Battlefield 2, working together, healing teammates, supplying ammunition, reviving the fallen earned viewpoints on the scoreboard.
All right, the teamwork mechanics.
On a large, vehicle-heavy map with wide-open fields getting 30 or 40 points in a round was an excellent performance. On Karkand, you could easily double or triple that score because you were constantly frantically reviving and resupplying teammates in the middle of this dense, close quarters chaos.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Based on the technical analysis in our sources, this perfect balance of intense, high-pressure infantry combat wasn't entirely a stroke of genius by the developers.
No, not at all.
A lot of it was a complete structural
A
accident.
very happy accident born entirely of the hardware limitations in 2005.
Right. The fog of war. Today, if you boot up a game, you expect to stand on a skyscraper and see clear across a city for miles. Every window, every tree is rendered perfectly.
You can see everything.
But in 2005, PC graphics cards would literally crash or melt if they tried to draw a fully detailed, sprawling urban city all at once.
The Engine Refractor 2 just couldn't handle the map.
Exactly. So to keep the game running at a playable frame rate, the developers implemented a harsh render distance limiter.
They basically draped a thick, dusty fog over everything beyond a certain point.
Yeah. If a building was, say, 200 meters away, it simply didn't exist visually. It was just a gray, dusty void.
And if we examine how that graphical limitation interacts with the gameplay flow, we see that it fundamentally saved the map's balance.
How so?
Let's think of the geometry. If the fog wasn't there, a sniper could sit 400 meters away on a hill outside the city and simply pick off attackers as they tried to cross the street toward the hotel.
The attackers would be paralyzed.
Completely. But because of the fog, those long sightlines were severed. You literally could not see your enemy until you were relatively close.
So it forced everyone together.
Right. It forced all engagements into a very specific, tense 50 to 150 meter range. It forced players to move up, to abandon the safety of distance, to use squad tactics, and to rely heavily on medics and support classes to survive the gauntlet.
Which created this incredibly chaotic nade spam environment. Because in Battlefield 2, pretty much every class you could choose carried 4 hand grenades.
It's just explosives flying everywhere.
Yeah, so you have dozens of players blinded by this hardware-limited fog, desperate to stop their tickets from bleeding out, just blindly hurling explosives down these narrow alleyways, hoping to clear a path.
It sounds like pure, unadulterated chaos.
And people just couldn't get enough of it.
It really established what the community and future level designers would come to call the Karkand formula.
What's the formula exactly?
It's a very specific recipe. It involves structured progression from the sprawling outskirts to a dense city center asymmetrical psychological tension and a heavy reliance on tight infantry vehicle synergy.
All wrapped up in that close to medium range combat.
Exactly.
So if Karkand was this dusty, modern-day meat grinder, completely reliant on a hardware limitation fog to function properly, how on earth did it survive the jump into a futuristic frozen apocalypse?
That is the million-dollar question.
Because this transitions us into what I think is the most conceptually wild and fascinating part of our deep dive, like the Battlefield 2142 era.
Oh, the 2142 iteration is just a remarkable case study. It's an incredible example of community influence dictating official development.
Right, because initially it wasn't even in the game.
Exactly. When Battlefield 2142 launched in late 2006, Karkand wasn't in it. The game was a massive departure from modern combat. It was set over 100 years in the future during a catastrophic new ice age that was swallowing the globe.
Just a totally different vibe.
Yeah, the factions were the European Union and the Pan-Asian Coalition fighting over the last remaining habitable land.
And the tech was insane, right?
Yeah, the technology involved bipedal mechs called battle walkers hover tanks, active camouflage, and massive floating heavily armed dreadnoughts called Titans.
And the community looked at all this incredible high-concept sci-fi tech and essentially said, yeah, giant floating dreadnoughts are cool, but where is our dusty Middle Eastern city?
They absolutely did. The demand from the player base just never faded. They wanted their meat grinder back.
It's so funny.
So in late 2009, as part of a massive update known as the 1.51 patch map designer Jason Bryce, and the developers officially ported the map over.
But they didn't just drop a dusty desert map into an ice game.
No, it wasn't just a lazy copy-paste job to appease the fans. Karkand was entirely reimagined to fit the lore.
Oh man, this is my favorite part.
It was transformed into a Pan-Asian Coalition Titan manufacturing plant hidden deep in the encroaching ice. The desert sand was replaced with snowdrifts. The sunlight was replaced with a harsh, cold, metallic gloom.
I was trying to come up with a way to describe this shift, and the best I could think of is like taking a traditional, brutal, medieval jousting tournament, keeping the exact same rules and the exact same arena, but suddenly giving every knight a hoverboard and a laser lance.
That is brilliant.
Right. The physical boundaries of the arena are identical, but the tools used to navigate it completely break the old paradigms. How did that futuristic tech actually impact those infamous gridlock choke points we just talked about?
Well, this is where the brilliant interplay between old map design and new mechanics really shines. The 2142 mechanics didn't just alter the flavor of the map. They actively fixed many of the original's frustrating structural flaws without changing a single wall or building.
Wait, really? Give me an example.
Let's look at the introduction of a vehicle called the Goliath.
Right, the Goliath. These guides describe it as a massive, heavily armored transport for the EU forces.
Yes. In the original Battlefield 2, the US forces had standard M1 Abrams tanks. They'd roll up to the hotel flag, try to push through the choke point, and immediately get decimated by anti-tank rockets raining down from the rooftops and alleyways.
So the tank blows up the push dolls and the meat grinder resumes.
Exactly. But the Goliath in 2142 was fundamentally different. It wasn't just a tank, it acted as a mobile, heavily armored, regenerating spawn point.
Oh, wow. So imagine a game of tug of war where instead of just pulling a rope, you can drive a 10-ton concrete wall up the middle of the field and your teammates can magically teleport safely behind it.
That's a perfect analogy. It was a moving fortress. The EU forces could literally drive this massive armored wall directly into the center of the choke point. It absorbed an incredible amount of damage.
And the infantry just flooding out from behind it.
Right. Infantry could safely spawn directly behind it, using the vehicle's massive chassis as cover to fan out into the alleyways. It finally allowed the attackers a consistent structural method to break that notorious hotel front line without getting trapped and slaughtered in their spawn.
That is so smart. And they address the grenade spam issue too, right? Because throwing grenades at a giant metal wall doesn't seem very effective anyway.
They addressed it through a fundamental restructuring of the class system. Battlefield 2142 consolidated the sprawling 7-class system of the previous game down to just 4 distinct classes.
Less classes means less explosive spam.
Well, specifically, the most crucial change was merging the medic kit and the assault kit.
Okay, walk me through the causality of that. Why does combining the guy who shoots the main rifle with the guy who heals people suddenly stop a rain of explosives?
In the previous game, the assault class carried the grenades and the rifle, but they could be constantly resupplied by a separate support player throwing ammo boxes at their feet. It was an endless loop of throwing and reloading.
I see.
By compressing the classes, the dynamics of squad dependency shifted. The player wielding the primary assault rifle was now also responsible for healing teammates. They no longer had an endless, dedicated supply of explosives at their fingertips because the distribution of gadgets was rebalanced across fewer roles.
So you had to choose between be helpful or blowing stuff up.
Exactly. You couldn't just have an entire squad dedicated to throwing grenades. You needed people dropping specialized futuristic shields, using EMP strikes, and managing medical hubs.
Right.
The endless cycle of explosive resupplies that defined the original meat grinder was naturally starved out by the new class economy.
But reading through these community retrospectives, it seems they just traded one nightmare for another. Because while the grenade spam vanished, they replaced it with something arguably much more terrifying.
You're talking about the recon class.
Yes. Let's talk about the recon class and the active camo gadget. Because the way players remember this, it sounds like Karkand turned from a war movie into a full-blown survival horror game.
It absolutely shifted the psychological landscape of the map. In modern shooters, a sniper is someone who sits far away. But remember, Karkand is a dense, close-quarters city.
So snipers are useless, right?
Well, the recon class in 2142 possessed a cloaking device. It didn't make them completely invisible, but it rendered the player model about 90% transparent, blending them into the icy metallic background of the environment.
Wait, 90% invisible in a dense, multi-story, snow-covered urban maze? That sounds incredibly unfair. How do you even fight that?
The genius of the design was in its auditory counterbalance. The only warning defenders had was a very specific, faint pulsating electronic hum emitted by the cloak when the recon player got within a few meters.
Oh my god, that sounds terrifying.
Think about how that fundamentally changes a defender's mindset. Karkand went from a loud, explosive, visually overwhelming frontal assault to a deeply paranoid game of cat and mouse.
Yeah, you're not even looking anymore.
Imagine you are holding the square flag. You are scanning the icy shadowed alleyways. You aren't just looking for movement anymore. You are literally holding your breath, trying to listen over the sound of distant gunfire for a faint electronic hum.
Because you know there's a guy right next to you.
Because you know an invisible saboteur armed with high explosives is creeping inches away from you, trying to sneak past the front line to destroy your commander's radar and artillery assets in the backfield.
That is incredible.
Okay.
It completely flips the dynamic from brute force to psychological tension. And they didn't just change the tools, they changed the rules of engagement too.
That's right, they did.
They introduced a new game mode specifically for this era called Assault Lines.
Yes. In the original Conquest Assault, the system had a fatal flaw. A single sneaky player could bypass the chaotic frontline run all the way through the empty streets to the back of the map and capture the enemy's main uncapturable base.
Basically just stealing the win.
Essentially bleeding the enemy out from behind and ending the round prematurely. It felt cheap and deeply frustrating to lose a hard-fought frontline battle because one guy slipped through an alleyway.
So how did Assault Lines fix it?
Assault Lines fixed the structural flaw by enforcing a linear progression. It forced the attacking EU forces to capture and hold all forward positions before the final Pan-Asian coalition main base even became vulnerable to capture.
Oh, so you literally couldn't backcap them.
Exactly. It felt a solid, structured front line. You had to earn the right to attack the final base.
But human nature being what it is, players still found ways to try and pull off the ultimate flanking move. I have to highlight my absolute favorite tactic mentioned in these sources, which the community lovingly refers to as the Chad Canal swim.
It is a classic high-risk, high-reward maneuver that perfectly illustrates player ingenuity.
The sources describe it like a covert ops mission gone rogue. So if the front line at the hotel was completely hopelessly locked down by Goliaths and battle walkers, a squad of attackers would literally dive into the freezing icy canals that bordered the edges of the map.
Which is practically a death sentence.
Right, remember this is an ice age. They would swim all the way around the massive main bridges, completely exposing themselves to enemy snipers, risking death by proximity claymores that defenders would deliberately hide in the reeds on the riverbanks.
It was grueling.
They would swim for several minutes completely out of the fight just for a tiny chance to climb up a ladder deep behind enemy lines and flip a rear capture point to break the stalemate.
And if they failed, it was a massive waste of resources.
Yeah, but it was considered the mark of a true, hard veteran to pull that off successfully and survive.
And this specific meta, the interplay of the Goliaths, the paranoia of the invisible recons, the desperation of the canal swims, it created such a profound, perfectly balanced ecosystem that even today, in our current year of 2026, it absolutely refuses to die.
Yeah, let's talk about that because the sources mentioned something called the 2142 Reclamation Project. Didn't EA, the publisher, shut down the official servers for this game years ago? I assumed you couldn't even play it anymore.
Officially, you can't. In 2014, following the shutdown of a pivotal third-party matchmaking service called GameSpy Battlefield 2142, was effectively rendered unplayable online.
So it's just dead.
But a game only truly dies when its community stops caring. A group of highly dedicated programmers and fans rebuilt the entire master server infrastructure from scratch using open source tools like OpenSpy.
Oh, wow. Creating what is known as the BF2142 hub. Right.
Exactly. What this means, simply put, is that they tricked the game clients into talking to a fan-run server instead of the dead official ones.
That is some serious dedication.
Even now, over 20 years after the game launched, you have this dedicated core of maybe 35 to 45 players who gather every single weekend to play this exact icy version of Karkand.
That's wild, just a tiny group keeping it alive.
They aren't just playing a game, they are actively preserving a highly specific tactical ecosystem, a piece of digital history that doesn't exist anywhere else in modern gaming.
Okay, so the narrative arc here is pretty clear. The community loved Karkand in the original BF2, and they practically worshipped the brilliant tactical sci-fi port in 2142.
It was a massive success.
Naturally, the developers Deity E, seeing this massive popularity, decided to bring it back officially with a huge budget in 2011 for Battlefield 3 and an expansion pack called Back to Karkand.
A very logical business move.
But as our sources so vividly and somewhat angrily illustrate, throwing more money and prettier graphics at a masterpiece does not always equal better gameplay.
This specific era of the map's history raises a vital question about game development. What happens when a modern studio tries to recreate a classic without truly understanding the invisible, underlying structural pillars that made it work in the first place?
I want to be fair to the developers here, because reading the descriptions of the BF3 version, it looked absolutely spectacular. It was built on the Frostbite 2 engine.
Which was revolutionary at the time.
Yeah, for you listening, Frostbite 2 was famous for its micro-destruction. You couldn't just blow up a whole building. You could shoot the plaster off a wall to expose the bricks underneath.
The detail was insane.
The sources describe this incredibly cinematic, jaw-dropping start to the map. Like the round begins, an F-18 fighter jet screams overhead, entirely unscripted, and drops a massive bomb directly on the hotel capture point, blowing the facade to pieces and creating all this dynamic physics-based rubble right as the infantry rush in.
It really does sound like a movie.
Visually, it sounds like an interactive Michael Bay movie.
Visually, it was a triumph of technology, but mechanically, if we look deeply at the community feedback on Reddit and the tactical forums from that era, it suffered from critical foundational missteps.
What was the biggest issue?
First, and perhaps most bafflingly, they fundamentally altered the layout for the massive 64-player version of the game. They completely removed two vital capture points from the original BF2 design.
Now wait, Why does removing 2 little capture points matter so much on a map that is already sprawling and huge? Shouldn't condensing the action make it more intense?
It matters entirely because of the 7-lane structure we discussed earlier. Every point on that map served a geographical purpose.
Okay, so what did those 2 points do?
Those 2 specific points provided crucial wide flanking routes around the dense city center. In the BF3 version, because those routes were gone, if the defending forces, which were now the Russians, were pushed out of the city and pushed past the main bridge, they had absolutely no alternative routes to counterattack.
So they were just trapped.
The map narrowed into a funnel. They were locked in an inescapable choke point. Their tickets would bleed out rapidly, turning the map into a frustrating, entirely linear meat grinder grind.
Ugh, that sounds awful.
The community constantly compares this flawed layout to another notorious BF3 map operation, Metro. The quote-unquote purple area, the vital wide flanking zone that allowed smart teams to maneuver and break a stalemate, was effectively erased from existence.
So they broke the geometry. But what does this all mean for the actual moment-to-moment combat balance? I'd push back a little here and say, well, the guides mentioned the BF3 version finally officially fixed the grenade spam.
They did, yes.
They added cooldown timers so you couldn't just throw grenades endlessly and you couldn't hold as many.
Yeah.
Isn't that a massive win for the overall gameplay loop? Doesn't that make it a better game?
It is a win in isolation, yes. The grenade mechanics were objectively modernized and improved. But that mechanical fix was entirely overshadowed by the single biggest architectural loss.
Which was?
The total removal of the hardware-limited fog of war.
Ah, because the Frostbite 2 engine was incredibly powerful. It could render the whole city perfectly out to the horizon without breaking a sweat.
Exactly. The developers had this shiny new engine and they wanted to show off what it could do. They wanted to show you the dust particles settling a mile away. So they gave players crystal clear, high-definition sightlines across the entire map. But remember our earlier analysis. The fog of war was the accidental glue holding Karkand's entire balance together. It severed the long sightlines.
Right, so now without it,
Without that visual limitation, snipers could simply sit on the hills overlooking the city or on top of the newly destructible cranes and dominate the entire map with high-powered optics.
you just couldn't move.
You couldn't push the streets, you couldn't cross an intersection because you were being picked off with perfect clarity from 400 meters away. It completely shattered that tense, squad-based 50 to 150 meter tactical flow that made the original such a masterpiece.
So, by giving players the ability to see everything beautifully, they fundamentally broke the very thing they were trying to honor. The graphics literally destroyed the gameplay.
That's a perfect way to summarize it.
Which brings us directly to the focal point of today's deep dive, the whole reason we are looking at this right now, April 2026.
The modern era.
We're looking at Battlefield 6. According to the community consensus in our sources, BF6 is suffering from a very specific design philosophy problem.
It's a common issue with modern games.
Yeah, it features these massive, sprawling, wide-open maps designed for 128 players with way too many open lines of sight, too many vehicles, and just not enough cover.
It's essentially a sniper and vehicle playground.
Players are practically begging Dicey, the developers, for a Back to Karkand Season 3 DLC to bring back that structured, infantry-focused, lane-based combat of the past.
But they are tired of waiting.
Right. The corporate roadmap doesn't have Karkand on it.
And this is precisely where community passion steps in to fill the void left by official development. When the studio won't build it, the players will.
Enter a player named EIGuimaraes, using something called the BF6 Portal Sandbox, which for you listening is basically an incredibly complex in-game toolset that allows players to manipulate logic place assets and create custom game modes and maps. EIGuimaraes decides to just build Strike at Karkand themselves.
From absolute scratch.
From scratch, inside a game engine that is fighting them every step of the way.
And the Discord logs we have, spanning from April 17th to April 28th, 2026, offer a phenomenal, real-time, ground-level look into the mind of an indie developer wrestling with modern engine constraints to recreate a 20-year-old experience.
That's so cool.
It is a masterclass in problem solving.
Let's really dig deep into these logs because they are absolute gold. It reads like a suspense thriller for game nerds. Right out of the gate on April 18th, EIGuimaraes hits the biggest hurdle we literally just talked about regarding BF3.
The fog.
Yes, the fog. BF6, being a modern, hyper-realistic game, doesn't have a built-in hard fog of war setting to just turn on. The engine wants you to see everything.
EIGuimaraes acutely understood the history. They knew that without the fog, their recreated map would suffer the exact same fate as the failed BF3 remake.
It would just be a sniper's paradise, completely unplayable for infantry.
Exactly. The challenge was massive. How do you artificially recreate a 2005 hardware limitation inside a 2026 game engine that is explicitly designed to prevent that exact visual degradation?
And how do they crack it? Because reading this, it sounds like they were pulling their hair out for days trying to figure it out.
It was a process of intense trial and error. According to a breakthrough conversation with a fellow user named Woodsy on April 26, EIGuimaraes started experimenting with an environmental asset called a VL7 cloud.
What's a VL7 cloud?
Now, this asset is normally used to create small, localized smoke effects, like a burning vehicle or a tiny localized dust storm. Initially, EIGuimaraes used 2 of these clouds and scaled them to size 30, trying to blanket the map, but it was inconsistent. The fog intensity changed too drastically as players moved through the suburbs. One street would be clear, the next would be pitch black.
So it wasn't a uniform fog at all?
No, not at all. Finally, EIGuimaraes discovered a mathematical anomaly in the engine. By taking a single VL7 cloud asset and scaling it massively to an unprecedented size 200, they found the exact perfect sweet spot.
Size 200. That's insane.
It blanketed the entire playable area, giving players the visual effects of being in a thick, oppressive atmosphere, effectively cutting off sniper sight lines at 150 meters without completely blinding them when they ran inside buildings.
Woodsy even replies in the chat, "Aha, so I just didn't go big enough. Well done."
Yeah.
It's so cool seeing these creators troubleshoot this together in real time.
The community collaboration is great.
But faking the fog was just the beginning of the nightmare. Let's talk about community playtesting, specifically a tester named Clara Thread on April 22nd. I absolutely love Clara Thread. She came in and just ruthlessly, gleefully broke the map.
Playtesters are truly the unsung heroes of game development. A developer designs a space assuming players will walk through the door. A playtester tries to climb through the chimney.
Exactly.
What exact exploit did she find?
Well, she drops this massive, detailed block of feedback in the Discord. First of all, she praises the atmosphere, giving the fog and the lighting a 10 out of 10. But then she points out how the modern mechanics of BF6 completely break the old, carefully structured map design of Karkand. Specifically, she abused a new gadget called the assault ladder.
The problem of verticality.
Right. Think about it. In the original 2005 game, you could only get on a roof if the developer had explicitly built a physical ladder onto the side of that specific building. The paths were controlled.
You couldn't just climb a flat wall.
Exactly.
It'd be...
In BF6, players can carry and place their own portable ladders anywhere they want. Clara Theria used this modern gadget to climb onto out-of-bounds rooftops, completely bypassing the intended 7 lanes. She even managed to scale a multi-story hotel and shoot down into the spawn points.
This is a classic, agonizing level design nightmare. When you introduce a radically new movement mechanic like grappling hooks, jetpacks, or portable ladders into a legacy space that wasn't designed for it, the spatial integrity usually collapses.
Players just go everywhere.
Players go where they aren't supposed to be, and the flow is ruined.
So how did EIGuimaraes address the assault ladder problem without removing the gadget from the game entirely? It required some serious, tedious problem solving. On April 23rd, EIGuimaraes pushes a massive update to the server. First, they went through the map and replaced several 3-story building assets with shorter 2-story buildings to better match the original BF2 scale and make the rooftops less advantageous.
Okay, that helps a bit.
Then they had to manually paint kill zones and invisible out-of-bounds polygon volumes onto the surfaces of all the inaccessible roofs. If you climbed up there with a ladder, you'd get a 10-second warning before the game just killed you.
A harsh but necessary fix.
They even had to physically extend the NATO HQ spawn area, adding huge concrete walls because the terrain tools in the Portal sandbox were so finicky that players were using ladders to glitch and fall into the map.
It's a constant, exhausting game of whack-a-mole. You fix the geometry, but then you alter the sightlines. And when you alter the sightlines, you have to worry about cover.
Exactly. And that brings up my absolute favorite exchange in the entire Discord log. A conversation with the username Benin.
Oh, Benin.
Yeah, Benin is playing the map and points out that Karkand needs microcover. It needs things like sandbags, stacked crates, potted plants, and concrete street barricades for infantry to hide behind when they are pushing up the street.
Which is vital for infantry survivability.
But there's a massive glaring problem with the BF6 engine that makes this incredibly difficult.
Let me guess. The advanced destruction physics.
Yes. BF6 is incredibly realistic, so EIGuimaraes would spend hours carefully placing sandbags and wooden barricades to create safe paths for infantry. But as soon as the 64-player match started, tanks would roll down the street, fire explosive shells, and simply obliterate all the carefully placed cover in the first 2 minutes.
Leaving the map completely bare.
The map would be stripped bare, leaving the infantry completely exposed and flat, empty streets to be slaughtered. So Benin suggests using tank hedgehogs. You know, those giant metal jacks you see on beaches, or heavy stone barriers.
A very logical suggestion, but I assume the Portal toolset didn't have indestructible versions of those assets.
It didn't. The engine insisted that everything must be destructible. So I have to push back a little in the solution here, because EIGuimaraes' fix is hilarious, but seems kind of insane.
What did they do?
I'm going to quote this directly from the logs because it made me laugh out loud. I need indestructible stuff, so I think I will put more cars and cars and cars.
More cars?
Wait, but wouldn't a map littered with hundreds of abandoned indestructible civilian cars just look like a massive, messy junkyard? Doesn't that completely ruin the military immersion?
Yes.
Like, how does that feel like a war zone and not a used car lot?
It absolutely sacrifices a degree of visual purity. It is a brute force duct tape solution, but it illustrates a profound hierarchy in game design. Gameplay flow must always trump visual immersion.
Function over form.
If the engine won't let you make a sandbag indestructible, and you desperately need a barrier that won't vanish when a tank shoots it, you use what the engine does provide. In BF6, burned-out vehicle chassis models act as static, indestructible objects.
They just spammed them everywhere.
EIGuimaraes littered the streets with cars and cars and cars because a messy, congested street that provides permanent cover is infinitely more fun to play on than a beautiful, immersive street where you die instantly because the cover blew away.
Function over form every time.
Yeah.
But all of this geometry, tweaking all these massive size 200 custom fog clouds and endless labyrinths of indestructible cars, it comes at a very real technical cost.
And yes, the literal physical limitation of the game's memory allocation.
Right. On April 25th, EIGuimaraes announces to the Discord with a mix of triumph and exhaustion. So I think it reached the final frontier on my map. The file size limit.
Oh, man.
They had literally packed the BF6 portal system to its absolute hard-coded maximum capacity. They couldn't place a single extra car, a single extra sandbag, or tweak one more polygon without the game refusing to save the file.
We hit the ceiling.
They pushed the modern engine to the absolute breaking point just to make this 20-year-old city function correctly.
The sheer dedication and technical stubbornness is staggering. It is a testament to the power of community memory. But I understand, based on the final logs, that there was one last element they squeezed in right under the file size limit.
Oh yeah, there was.
A feature that really solidified this as an emotional passion project rather than just a dry technical exercise in level design.
The secret weapon. The ultimate nostalgia Easter egg. The audio layer.
I love this part.
On April 22nd, a user named Shadow drops a message in the chat. I know it's wild and never probably happened, but what if we could add the music from Battlefield 2 into the loading screen? And EIGuimaraes doesn't say anything. They just reply by casually dropping an audio file into the chat. Another user, Seals Dragon, listens to it and absolutely loses their mind.
What exactly was the audio file?
Well, EIGuimaraes somehow managed to circumvent the portal tools, went onto the internet and extracted the original highly compressed 2005 USMC Commander voice lines from a grainy 10-year-old YouTube video uploaded by a random user named Banan442.
That is hilarious.
They took these raw, low-quality audio files, converted them, and forcibly imported them into the BF6 map logic. So imagine this. You were playing this incredibly modern, hyper-realistic, graphically stunning game in 2026. The guns sound like thunder. The graphics are pristine.
Very immersive.
And suddenly, right as you capture a point, you hear the grainy, distorted, intensely aggressive 2005 commander screaming over your radio. Obey your order, soldier! You are the worst squad I've had the misfortune to ever see.
That is an incredible detail. It's an auditory ghost haunting a modern machine. And if we step back and analyze why EIGuimaraes went to such extreme, agonizing lengths, hitting hard file size limits, reverse engineering visual fog, using smoke assets, painting invisible kill boundaries on roofs, ripping 20-year-old audio from obscure YouTube videos, it tells us something vital and perhaps a bit melancholy about the current state of modern gaming.
What's your read on it? Because it feels like more than just a guy who misses his childhood game.
It is much more. This wasn't just simple nostalgia. It wasn't just a desire to see an old map rendered with shiny new graphics, because we already saw how that failed with BF3.
Yeah, that was a disaster.
It was a desperate, calculated community course correction. The players in 2026 feel deeply that modern multiplayer maps have lost their soul. They feel modern games lack the structured, methodical progression, the asymmetrical psychological tension of Conquest Assault, and the distinct, purposeful lanes of the Refractor 2 era.
Everything now is just a massive open sandbox where you run in circles.
Exactly. EIGuimaraes wasn't just rebuilding a city called Karkand. They were trying to resurrect the underlying Karkand formula that they believe the modern AAA game design industry has entirely forgotten or abandoned in favor of scale and spectacle.
There's a statement.
They were using the complex tools of the present to aggressively try and teach the developers a lesson about the structural brilliance of the past.
It's a love letter to a bygone era, but it's also a highly functional, playable manifesto.
Exactly. It's a playable critique of modern design.
And the absolute best part of this entire deep dive is that you listening right now, you don't just have to hear us talk about the theory of it.
Yeah.
You can literally step into this history today.
That's the beauty of it.
If you are listening to this right now and you own a copy of Battlefield 6, you can boot up the game, navigate to the Portal Community tab, click on Search Experiences, and type in these exact codes. Are you ready?
Get a pen out.
If you want to explore the map completely solo, just to walk the streets, take in the incredible oppressive atmosphere, and see that massive VL7 fog cloud in action without getting shot at, enter the codes V4.
Highly recommend doing that just to see the fog.
But if you want to experience the true authentic chaos of the Conquest Assault meat grinder, enter the codes VFA. That specific code will load you into the custom map with 30 highly tuned AI bots per team.
Which is just a brilliant way to test it.
You can actually stand on a roof and watch how the bots naturally figure out the 7 lanes, how they utilize the indestructible car barricades, and how they organically spread out to capture the flags under the fog. It is a monumental, awe-inspiring achievement by a single stubborn fan.
It truly is a masterwork of digital preservation and adaptation. And as we wrap up this extensive deep dive into the history of Karkand, it leaves us with a lingering, almost philosophical question about how we consume digital media.
I love these. Let's hear it.
We spend so much of our time and money demanding better graphics, infinite render distances, higher resolutions, and endless unbroken sightlines in our virtual worlds. We constantly demand engines that can simulate reality perfectly without flaw or limitation.
Right, everyone wants the most realistic game possible.
But looking at the 2-decade legacy of Strike At Karkand, from the strict rendering hardware limits of 2005 that accidentally forged a tactical masterpiece to EIGuimaraes, spending weeks artificially forcing a giant blinding fog cloud into the flawless engine of Battlefield 6 today just to make the map fun to play, makes you wonder.
Wonder what?
Are the most perfect, engaging, and memorable digital spaces the ones defined entirely by their limitations?
That is a profound thought to chew on. Next time you get sniped from 400 meters away across a beautifully rendered, completely open, utterly flawless modern map.
Something to think about while you wait to respawn.
Thank you for joining us on this massive journey through digital archaeology, from the dusty 2005 meat grinder through the freezing paranoid 2142 Ice Age, the flawed cinematic gloss of BF3, and finally into the triumphant community-driven modern BF6 sandbox. We'll be back next time to extract more fascinating insights, hidden stories, and structural secrets from our sources. Until then, keep diving deep.